Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Vicky at ADVOCACY Learning Team. Before we start, I'd like to let everyone know that there is a chat area in the left corner down at the bottom of your screen, where you can see type message here. This is the area where you can type in your question or let us know if you are experiencing any technical difficulty. Now, can I please have someone to type into that area to confirm that the sound is coming through? Oh, thank you. Good. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll quickly go through some housekeeping matters. Today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to ADVOCACY YouTube channel. I'll send you the YouTube link when it is ready in a follow-up email next week, together with a copy of the slides in PDF format. At the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to a quick survey. Please stay and complete the survey, and we're keen to hear your feedback. As the presentation goes, please feel free to type in your question. Our speaker will address your questions as he goes or at the end of the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Mika Kontiainen, Director, Disability of DFAT. I'm now handing over to Mika.
Thank you, Vicky, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as Vicky introduced me, I am Mika Kontiainen. I'm the Director of Disability in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My area is one that is responsible for coordinating and leading on Australia's international engagement on disability. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon, sitting in this reasonably sunny office here in Ackford in Canberra, and going through this webinar presentation. It's, I think, the third or fourth time that I've delivered an Ackford webinar on disability inclusion. I've taken a slightly different approach to this particular webinar from different in the past, in that I won't be focusing as much on the technical detail of how to do disability inclusion, but rather looking more broadly at some of the big picture issues around disability inclusion. Now, as Vicky said, please feel free to use the chat box in the corner to type in questions or make comments. From a personal perspective, I actually don't really enjoy doing these webinars because I find myself talking to a computer screen, and it's very hard to engage with your audience when you can't actually see them. For all I know, you could all be eating your lunch, which is probably not a bad idea, or actually even having a bit of a snooze at your desk. If it was a live audience, I'd actually at least be able to throw a pen at you to wake you up. But on this occasion, I'll just assume that people are paying attention. Just as an aside too, in case you are wondering, my name is actually Finnish in origin. I get that asked a few times. So, what has changed since the last time I spoke on an Ackford webinar on disability inclusion is that in about a year ago, the Australian government launched its 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. And one of the key things from my perspective in the Foreign Policy White Paper is that it clearly affirms that disability inclusion, like gender equality, is a cross-cutting priority for Australia's international engagement on human rights, on development, and on humanitarian action. In fact, it's interesting that when you look at the Foreign Policy White Paper, every time there is a reference to disability, it is alongside references to gender equality, which clearly highlights, in my mind, the intersectionality between the two issues of disability inclusion and gender equality. The white paper actually also recognises that the promotion of disability and the rights of persons with disabilities is one of 6 key focus areas for Australia's current term on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, preceding the Foreign Policy White Paper, we've we have a couple of strategies on disability inclusion that have guided DFAT's efforts in this space for a while, and they are the development for all strategies. There's a current strategy and a previous strategy. The previous strategy, which is on the left of the screen, was subtitled Towards a Disability Inclusive Aid Program, and that was for the period up to 2014. The current strategy, which is now about strengthening the Disability Inclusive Aid Program, runs from 2015 to 2020. That strategy was launched 3.5 years ago now by the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, at which time she actually emphasised how important disability inclusion is for Australia's international work. If you have an interest at all in how what DFAT focuses on, I would encourage you to have a look at the strategy. I will come back to the strategic framework within the strategy a little later in my slides and talk about a few key aspects of it. But at this point, I just wanted to flag that they are the two that is the guiding document that we work towards. Now, what you might not know is that disability inclusion is very closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. 5 of the SDGs include disability within the goals, and there are specific mentions of people with disabilities throughout the goals and the targets more specifically, or in relation to references to persons in vulnerable situations. One of the things that Australia takes a bit of pride in is that it was our advocacy in the negotiations for the Sustainable Development Goals, along with others, that helped contribute and ensure that language on disability and inclusion was prominent in the overarching statement, in the goals and the targets. Now, I mentioned our Development for All strategy. It's worth also noting that internally within DFAT we have a disability action plan or an action strategy. This is the document and the approach we take internally within DFAT on how to be a disability inclusive employer and service provider. There are a number of points within that strategy which are of potential interest to our implementing partners, including ADVOCACY partners, and that includes commitments to advocate for disability inclusive clauses in our aid contracts and to actually improve disability inclusiveness in DFAT procurement. There is a strong focus at the moment on disability inclusion within DFAT under the leadership of our current Secretary, Frances Adamson, who is very strongly supportive of an inclusive work culture and an inclusive organisation. She frequently speaks about the value and the strength of diversity within organisations, including within DFAT, and this extends to her very strong support for disability inclusion within DFAT. There is a growing realisation within DFAT that having first-hand experience of disability or working with colleagues who have disability enhances your capacity to recognise the need and the opportunity for an inclusive approach in all the work that DFAT does, from our international policy engagement to our humanitarian work to our development work to the provision of services such as through the Australian Passport Office. Now, the question might come up, what actually is disability? So there is no single definition for disability. The definition that DFAT works towards is drawn from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which defines disability as follows. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Now, I've underlined in the slide the key words in that definition so that it's easy to understand the concept of disability. So it is firstly about impairments. So you might have a visual impairment or an impairment that makes it difficult or impossible to walk, or cognitive impairment. It's how those impairments interact with barriers in society that actually create the phenomenon that's known as disability. So in shorthand, it's impairments by barriers, or impairments plus barriers, which actually creates disability. So the sort of barriers that we're talking about here can be attitudinal barriers, stigma and discrimination, and the perspective that a person with a disability can't do something. They can be physical barriers, simply things like stairs or inaccessible toilets, narrow doorways, buses that you can't get onto, transport and so forth. They could be legislative or policy impairments, which either undermine or don't uphold the rights of persons with disabilities. They could be communication impairments, communication barriers, which prevent people from being able to communicate effectively. But the key point here is that disability is about impairments and barriers in interaction which prevent or hinder the participation of people on an equal basis with others in society. The definition, unsurprisingly, since it's drawn from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, takes a very rights-based approach to disability. That is, that the way to address disability is to support people's rights and to address the barriers. It's about finding ways of overcoming the barriers. It is not about fixing the impairments, nor is it simply about providing charity to people with disabilities. Now, how you actually go about addressing barriers, how you go about identifying and addressing barriers is many and varied. It depends on the circumstances. And this is where I'm deviating from my previous ACFID webinar sessions, in that I'm not going to talk about barriers and ways of identifying them and overcoming them. But I will ask through the survey at the end of it whether next time around perhaps we should spend more time on this topic. I will say, however, that for any individual or organisation that is looking to address disability and they're trying to address barriers, a good starting point is to actually ask people with disabilities themselves or their representative organisations what are the barriers and how can we address them, how can we overcome them. Secondary option is to actually get technical assistance from people who actually understand disability inclusion. And within Australia, DFAT in particular, we actually have a very close partnership with CBM Australia, who provide us with technical assistance on disability inclusion and who are very good at helping to identify barriers and identify ways of overcoming those barriers. So why is disability inclusion a priority for DFAT? There's a whole bunch of statistics and facts on the screen in front of you. Essentially, about 1 in 7 people globally have a disability, and of those, about 80% live in developing countries. Globally, there's probably about 1 billion people who might not identify as having a disability, but who need one or more assistive products, things that are essential for people with disabilities to be able to live a healthy life. It could be assistive products like glasses or wheelchairs or walking canes or communication devices. There are a lot of people out there who actually experience disability. People with disabilities also often face stigma, exclusion and discrimination. They are certainly overrepresented amongst people living in persistent poverty and are less likely than others to be able to lift themselves out of poverty. Less than about 5% of children and young people with disabilities have access to education and training. And globally, the adult literacy rate is 85%. But for adults with disabilities, it is as low as 3% and as low as 1% for women with disabilities. Women with a disability are also 2 to 3 times more likely to be victims of physical and sexual abuse than women without disability. In low and middle income countries, only 5 to 15% of people who require assistive devices have access to them. And the impact on developing country economies can be quite substantial. There are estimates and studies that show between 3 to 7% of GDP is lost when people with disabilities are excluded from the workforce. Also of significance is that natural disasters and other crises disproportionately affect people with disabilities, who often experience barriers in accessing information, protection and assistance. And another statistic is that only 1 in 10 people in the global population that need assistive products have actually access to them. And overall, disability inclusive development, well, given all these factors, disability inclusive development is essential to reducing poverty, to strengthening economic development and to empowering women and girls. DFAT takes a disability inclusive development approach because it is clearly essential in order to be effective. You cannot achieve effective poverty alleviation if you don't actually take into consideration the needs of those people who are most likely to be left behind in our development efforts, and often that is women and girls or people with disabilities, and in particular women and girls with disabilities. So what is disability inclusive development? How do we go about doing it? Well, disability inclusive development specifically seeks to ensure that people with disabilities are able to both participate in and benefit from development activities on an equal basis with others. Now, what that means is that we are seeking to include people with disabilities both in the process of development and also in the outcomes. So in regards to the process, what we want to ensure is that people with disabilities are able to contribute to the design, the implementation and the monitoring of aid, of development work of aid, and also that they benefit from the outcomes. So that when we deliver a development program, we make an aid investment somewhere, we are not benefiting some people and inadvertently leaving other people behind, because sadly, if we do leave people behind, it's generally the most marginalised who are left behind. So there's, relative situation actually becomes worse. Now, in front of you now on the screen is a slide from the Development for All strategy, which shows the strategic framework on how we approach disability inclusion. I won't go through the whole strategic framework, but I will point out a few key elements of it. First of all, at the bottom, there are 2 key approaches that DFAT actually takes. First is what we call a twin track approach, which involves investing in both disability-specific activities as well as looking to mainstream disability into broader development efforts. So, for example, a disability-specific investment might be something that involves supporting a disabled people's organisation to be a more effective advocate for people with disabilities, or the provision of specific disability services. Mainstreaming efforts is about ensuring that a broader development project is inclusive of people with disabilities. And the example that I sometimes like to use is education. Education is a very good one here, in that if you're building a new school, for example, you would want to making sure that you build a school in an accessible way, so that you have accessible toilets and ramps and wide corridors, so that any children with wheelchairs, for example, are able to actually access the building. If you're training teachers, you would train teachers to actually work with children with disabilities. If you're providing educational material, you would consider what format that educational material might be needed. Now, in braille, large print, electronic form, so that kids with particular types of impairments, say visual impairments, can actually access those learning materials. And you would work to make sure that the school policies and practices are actually inclusive of children with disabilities, so that they are encouraged and supported to come to school and not left out. The second approach that's listed at the bottom of that strategic framework is about reasonable accommodation. That is about making adjustments, reasonable adjustments that will enable somebody to participate on an equal basis with others. Now, in a typical Australian workplace, for example, a reasonable accommodation could be providing somebody with a sit-stand desk, or making sure that they have access, that there are accessible toilets, or providing them with a larger computer screen, or providing them with voice-activated software so that they can actually dictate. There's all sorts of simple things that can be done. And the same applies when you're actually working in the development space. Small adjustments that meet the specific needs of individuals can make all the difference between inclusion and exclusion of that person in that development activity. Looking up from the bottom of the strategic framework, there's 4 boxes which identify the particular areas where it was identified a few years ago where there are strong opportunities for taking an inclusive approach. They are around implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, work around infrastructure and WASH, focusing on education and skills, and also focusing on humanitarian assistance, disaster risk reduction and social protection. That's not to say that we don't focus do disability inclusion work elsewhere. In fact, the aim of the Australian Aid Program is to make all our investments as inclusive as we can. It's that there are certain areas where the need and the opportunity for an inclusive approach is greater. One way of thinking about this is that if we are working in development and the program we are delivering has a direct impact on individuals, then there is a greater need for an inclusive approach, and there is a greater risk that we will actually exclude somebody. Another way of looking at it is that if you are taking a gender perspective to a particular program because you recognise that women and girls might be excluded or might not have equal access to the program, then it's almost certain that there is a disability perspective there as well, because it is about inclusion and exclusion. It's about who has access and who does not. The next row on the strategic framework talks about the guiding principles that we operate on. And the one that there's 2 that I actually want to particularly focus on or just mention is the box on the left-hand side, which is about supporting an active and central role for people with disabilities. That is a very strong focus, a strong pillar for DFAT and has been for a number of years. And it's about actively engaging with people with disabilities and their representative organisations in the design, the implementation and the monitoring of programs, and also in advocacy efforts. We back that up with a considerable effort in supporting capacity building of disabled people's organisations in developing countries. There is also, on the very right-hand side of that row of boxes, a reference to improving exclusion of a diverse range of people with disabilities. This is important because disability, which is part of the human condition, is incredibly diverse. The types of impairments that might impact types of impairments that might be impacted by barriers are many and varied, and not all of them are visible. Traditionally, most of the work around disability has tended to focus on people who have had visual impairments or mobility impairments, because they are often very good advocates and they have disabilities that are visible. There are lots of invisible disabilities which are less easy to actually recognise, such as people with hearing impairments or deaf or psychosocial and intellectual impairments. So they're the key areas there. Now, I'm just pausing here for a moment because I can see that Sonia's written a question. What role does your team have in producing guidance documents and resources for NGOs who want to better understand? Okay. So my team does provide guidance documents within DFAT. But we actually, as I mentioned earlier, we do work in close partnership with CBM Australia, who are our technical partners. Now, we don't provide guidance and support directly to NGOs. However, where NGOs are working in partnership with DFAT on a project, then there is there's scope for actually providing support. But what many Australian NGOs do, and certainly many ANCP partners, and that includes some of the active members do, is they actually seek technical support from CBM Australia in the same way that we do. There is also a resource, and there'll be a slide on this towards the end of my presentation. There is a resource called Development for All. It's, the website is www.did, the number 4, A-double-L, so did for all, as in the number 4, A-double-L, so did for all, as in Disability Inclusive Development for All.com.au. That's a web-based platform that is delivered under the DFAT CBM partnership with DFAT funding and with CBM expertise. And it has a public side to it where, as a public good, CBM provides a whole range of resources on disability inclusion that is accessible to anybody. The other side of that platform is actually a disability help desk that is accessible by DFAT officers. And indeed, if you happen to be working with DFAT on a particular project, while you yourself can't actually access the help desk, you can ask your DFAT partner to actually access the help desk and put in requests for specific technical assistance. Okay. Moving on. Now, having spoken about disability inclusion specifically, I just want to talk now about some of the international engagement that's happening on disability. This is where I'm not sure if this is actually going to be of interest to everybody, but it's taken up a lot of my time lately, so bear with me. I'm going to take up some of your time with it as well. So a major element of Australian work is around advocacy. Now, a year ago, on International Day of People with Disabilities, on the 3rd of December last year, the Office of Development Effectiveness, which is DFAT's independent evaluation arm, released a report on their evaluation of disability, the effectiveness of Australian advocacy for disability inclusion. It's an interesting report if you want to see what Australia is doing internationally on disability inclusion. But the key findings of that evaluation were that Australia's international advocacy on disability inclusion is credible, it's effective, and it's helping shape the policies and programs of our partners. This is actually consistent with anecdotal evidence that I'm very familiar with, in that, which clearly indicates that Australia is considered a global leader on disability inclusion. Internationally, our international partners, including partner governments, UN agencies, other development agencies around the world, other civil society organisations around the world that are engaged in development, often turn to Australia to see what we're doing, how we're doing, and to learn from it. There is a great deal of interest internationally, for example, in what we do domestically through around the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and there was a great deal of interest in what we actually do through the Australian Aid Program. But as advocates, Australia has been a strong and consistent voice in support of disability rights for about a decade now, and what I'm pleased to see is that advocacy is seeing organisations around the world that we work with becoming increasingly focused on doing a better job on disability. Organisations like the World Food Programme or the World Bank, some of our donor countries, some of our partner countries in developing countries. There's a lot of areas that we're still continuing to work on to improve, and there's a few summaries there in dot point form around recommendations. I won't go into those unless somebody comes back and asks me. But suffice to say that it's great to work in this space, because when I work with our international partners, I get to speak on a topic which is positive, has a positive impact on the lives of individuals, and where we are seen as a global leader. Now, another area of our international engagement is around the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. I've already spoken about the definition of disability that comes out of the CRPD. Every year, in about the second week of June, all of UN member states who are signatories to the convention gather in New York at the UN for the annual Conference of States Parties, which is an amazing forum for exchanging information about best practice in disability inclusion, and where you can probably imagine Australia actually gets a lot of airtime because of our ongoing efforts in that space. This year, at the Conference of States Parties, there was also an election to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is a UN experts committee that provides expert guidance on interpreting the interpreting the CRPD, and also evaluates and monitors implementation of the CRPD by member countries, and hears complaints from individuals around the world on whether their rights under the CRPD have been violated. This year, Australia nominated and was successful in seeing an Australian nominated to the committee, Rosemary Kayes. Rosemary, many of you would know her by reputation, if not her personally, is a phenomenal woman with a disability. She's a human rights lawyer, a disability rights advocate, and will be commencing her 4-year term on the committee on the 1st of January next year. And that's a picture of Rosemary at the convention this year, just as she was being elected to that important position. Another area of our international advocacy in the last 6 months or so has been around work with the Global Action on Disability Network, the GLAD network. The GLAD network is a coordination body of bilateral and multilateral donors. So it's got countries such as Australia, the UK, the Nordic countries, the US, Canada, Germany, Japan, countries with aid programs that actually focus to some extent on disability, along with the UN agencies that focus on this, private sector organisations, foundations and philanthropies who all actively contribute resources to disability inclusive development. And it's a way for these groups to actually coordinate better on their work. Australia, through DFAT, is currently the co-chair of the GLAD network. In fact, we have been since the beginning of 2016. And we are currently co-chair alongside the International Disability Alliance, who are the permanent co-chairs, and the UK Department for International Development, who's an incoming rotating co-chair. GLAD has a particular focus on inclusive education, social protection and humanitarian action, and does a lot of work behind the scenes, particularly around advocacy, sharing best practice and knowledge amongst donor organisations, and also coordinating activities at the country level. GLAD meets once a year. The last GLAD meeting was hosted by the Foreign Ministry of Finland in Helsinki in January, which I actually was delighted to attend because that's where I was born, but some of our partners, particularly from the Pacific, found the snowdrifts and sub-zero temperatures a bit challenging. The next GLAD meeting will be held early next year and will be hosted by the Canadians, Global Affairs Canada, to be precise, in Ottawa, probably in about April or May once the snows have melted in Ottawa. So GLAD is an important focus of Australia's international engagement at the moment because of the capacity it has for supporting international coordination in this space. The other thing that happened recently, well, a few months ago now, was the Global Disability Summit in London. And this was a one-off, well, so far a one-off event where the governments of the UK and Kenya, together with the International Disability Alliance, bringing everybody together, bringing about 1,000 delegates from across the globe together in London for an event which was designed to galvanise broader support for disability inclusive development and to bring in new actors into the space. The event was quite amazing, and the quality of people that were there was amazing, and what the outcomes in particular were actually quite worthwhile. For somebody who can occasionally get a little jaded about international meetings, which can be just talk fests, the Global Disability Summit as an exercise in promoting engagement and getting people to step up worked quite well. There were 170 sets of commitments made by organisations and partners, all of which are available online. If you just do a Google search on Global Disability Summit commitments, you'll be able to see all the commitments that were made by particular governments, donors, multilateral organisations and so forth. Amongst the commitments that were made were, for example, the World Bank, which controls a huge amount of development funding that goes into our region and beyond, made a commitment that by 2022 or 2025, all their infrastructure investments will be disability inclusive by design. And that's an amazing commitment, and one that will over time have substantial positive impact on the lives of people with disabilities. Australia also made a range of commitments as well. There was 10 that we actually made, commitments around stigma and tackling stigma and discrimination, using new technology and innovation on particular programs, supporting disabled people's organisations, and a particular headline commitment was providing substantial additional funding, 16.4 million to be exact, to support disability inclusive humanitarian action response into the Syrian crisis. So if you're at all interested to see what globally organisations, including NGOs, are committed to doing on disability inclusion, it's worth having a look at the Global Disability Summit commitments. The other thing that came out of the Global Disability Summit was a Charter for Change, which it's up there on the screen. It's a sort of a commitment from the participants at the summit to step up what they're doing on disability inclusive development, and the charter remains open. So if your organisation has signed up to the Charter for Change, fantastic, I commend you for it. If your organisation has not signed up to the Charter for Change, perhaps you're unaware of it, I'd encourage you to actually have a look at it and consider committing to the Charter for Change, which you can do online. Okay, now I spoke about the Office of Development Effectiveness evaluation of the efficacy of Australia's international advocacy on development. Next week, on Monday to be precise, ODE will be launching its second evaluation on the progress made to strengthen disability inclusion in the Australian Aid Program. So you lucky people on this webinar are actually getting a sneak preview as to something that's going to be launched on Monday. That's actually the cover of the report that's on the screen there. The report's very dense. It's got lots of fascinating material in there about disability inclusive programming all across the region and beyond, both in country programs, in regional programs and in global programs. What the evaluation found was that overall the Australian Aid Program has been making good progress in the last 10 years or so in strengthening disability inclusion. at the moment, about half of all aid investments, 40% if you count them by investment number, or 60% if you count them by value of investments, are disability inclusive. Some of our country and regional programs are doing better than others, not surprisingly, but disability inclusion is increasingly being mainstreamed into sectoral programs. It's particularly strong in global programs and increasing elsewhere. And also positive to see is that about a third of recent responses to humanitarian crises have been disability inclusive. So, in a nutshell, we're about halfway there. Now, that's nowhere near as well as we would like to be performing, but relative to other donors around the world, we are doing better than anybody else. When we talk with our other donors in the UK, in the Nordic countries, North America and Europe, and we say that only half of our aid investments are disability inclusive, the usual response is, wow, as many as that, because it takes time to do that. And in fact, taking time is one of the key enabling factors which were identified in the evaluation. It's sustained effort with a gradual scale up over many years that has enabled the Australian Aid Program to get to where it is, and its continuation of its sustained effort and continual scale up over forthcoming years that will hopefully lead to Australia having a fully disability inclusive aid program in the future. Other key elements, other key enabling factors included having a strong focus on engaging with people with disabilities, working in partnership with disabled people's organisations, and building the capacity of disabled people's organisations. A third important enabling factor identified in there is around the importance of technical assistance and, in fact, the importance of the partnership that DFAT has with CBM Australia in the provision of that technical assistance, and making sure that the technical assistance is easily, readily available to program officers across DFAT, so that disability can be embedded in the design of documents and design of aid investments from the ground up. And finally, two other enabling factors. One was having a supportive and engaged senior management. The senior management in DFAT, some of it is extremely supportive and engaged, the Secretary, for example, and quite a number of our heads of missions around the world, but not everybody. And so we're trying to improve that. And finally, going back to one of the basic approaches that were noted in the strategic framework from our strategy, having some dedicated funding for disability, particularly for reasonable accommodation, is really important. There are a bunch of recommendations in the report. Can't go into those now because that would be giving away too much before Monday's launch, but they suffice to say that they're really focusing on either things that DFAT is doing well and encouraging us to continue doing better, things that we can do to help create a better enabling environment within DFAT to deliver an inclusive program, and then certain areas where there is clearly room for improvement on disability inclusion. Now, one of the things that I'll just touch on is around monitoring and evaluation. If you've been involved in an Australian Aid Program investment, you might have come across the aid quality checks, the AQCs. In fact, so the AQCs, the aid quality checks, are one of the principal mechanisms by which we monitor the effectiveness of aid investments. In fact, it's AQC data that was used by the evaluation to come up with the finding that about half our investments are inclusive. The aid quality checks have a strong focus on looking at disability inclusion. There are two questions within the AQCs, which are a self-assessed evaluation done annually for aid investments worth more than $3 million, both of which relate to disability inclusion. And the questions there, you can see them on the screen. The thing to note is that the first question is about the process. The second question is about the outcome. So they lead once again back to what is disability inclusion, inclusive development fundamentally. It is both a process and an outcome. So if you are engaged in a development program with DFAT, particularly if it's worth more than $3 million, don't be surprised if you're asked by the DFAT program officers to come back and say something about how are you actually engaging with people with disabilities and what are you doing to identify and overcome barriers. I was involved, for example, in some planning work on the ANCP program, ANCP, earlier this week, and looking ahead at the future of the ANCP. And within it, there's a recognition that we need to continue to push for a stronger focus around M&E and particularly around an inclusive approach to women and girls and people with disabilities. So these sorts of proxy measures for how to measure inclusion come up in those contexts. Now, in terms of measuring performance and counting, one of the other things that often comes up and I often get asked about is the Washington Group short set of questions. If you are, for example, an ANCP partner, you might know that you are required as part of your funding agreement with DFAT to disaggregate your data by gender, disability, and a few other things as well, which escape me for the moment. The problem with counting disability is that it's not straightforward. Disaggregating by sex and working out how many people who identify as men or women you have is relatively easy. Identifying people with disabilities is not so easy. There is plenty of international evidence and domestic evidence in Australia that simply asking somebody, do you have a disability, will not get you the answers you are looking for. There are all sorts of reasons why any data collection tool that simply asks, do you have a disability, underreports disability. One is because of stigma and discrimination, people won't answer, they won't admit to it. Some people don't identify as having a disability even though they have impairments which are interacting with barriers in the environment and they're preventing them from engaging properly, and engaging equally with others. So the fact that you can't actually count disability easily was a problem that was identified over a decade ago by the United Nations Statistical Commission. And they were looking at this from the perspective of census data. And so the UN Statistical Commission brought together a group of statistical experts. Whenever they have a statistical problem, they actually invite national statistics officers, like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, to form a city group. And the first place that they meet is what then gives its name to the group. So 10 years ago, a bunch of statisticians met in Washington, formed the Washington Group. It's not a high-powered consulting firm, it just happens to have met first in Washington. And they spent a decade working through the problem of how do you actually count disability? What is a simple, effective way of doing it? Something that you can actually add to a census to actually ask questions. And they came up with this 6 set of questions, which, if you look at them, they don't mention disability at all. It's about identifying people with impairments and trying to work out how those impairments interact with barriers and the degree to which it prevents them from participating in life. Now, these questions have since been picked up by many programming areas, and they because you can use them wherever you are collecting data to be able to disaggregate the data to identify if people with disabilities are being included or excluded from whatever it is that you're doing. DFAT is a strong supporter of the Washington Group questions. We have been for a number of years, and we strongly encourage people to pick them up and use them. We do so because even though the questions are not perfect, they're relatively straightforward and simple, and they are fairly effective at being able to identify people with disabilities in large groups. I won't go into any more on that other than to say that it is one of many data tools that are out there. It just happens to be the one that is increasingly seen globally as the most simple and efficient data collection tool, particularly in low resource settings like in developing countries. Finally, Monday is International Day of People with Disabilities. So DFAT will be marking the occasion. We have in DFAT in Canberra, there'll be an event. The Secretary is hosting in the afternoon. where the ODE evaluation of disability inclusion in the AID program will be launched, and where annual internal DFAT awards for best picture and best practice in disability inclusion will be awarded. Just showing you here the winning photo from last year. Can't show you the winning photo for this year because that would be cheating. But the event that's happening on Monday is part of a global program where Australian missions around the world are doing various events to mark International Day of People with Disabilities and to promote further action on disability inclusion. Incidentally, on this particular photo, I actually like this photo because at first glance it doesn't look like there's much to do with disability inclusion there at all, except if you look closer, you'll see that both men actually have prosthetic limbs. Both of these men are actually clients of the CRPD Physical Rehabilitation Centre, which is supported by DFAT funded Disability Rights Initiative in Cambodia. And they actually received funding through this DRIP program to actually start up a motorcycle repair shop in Siem Reap in Cambodia. And because I'm a bit of a photographer and I like photos, I thought I'd show you the photo from last year's, the year before that, which was actually from the Caribbean, and it shows a 17-year-old young woman who lost her leg as a toddler when she fell into a well. And in this picture, you can see that she's having her prosthetic limb fixed by a guy called Michael Nelson, who's also an amputee himself. One of the things I like about this photo, it's a bit hard to see in there, is that the beanie that the prosthesis maker is wearing is very Caribbean, and in fact I'm sure it's a marijuana leaf that's actually on that beanie. So the fact that DFAT is promoting a beanie with a marijuana leaf on it leaves me speechless at times. But nonetheless, it's a wonderful photo, as was the other one, and indeed the photos that will be presented on Monday at DFAT's awards are equally great. So finally, there is the website that I mentioned earlier, the resource through which you can actually get access to a whole lot of information about what disability inclusive development can be all about. And then my final slide before I open up to any questions, should there any be, here's a few take-home messages for you. One is, it is a priority for us, and we ask that it is a priority for our partners as well. Disability inclusion is a process and an outcome. It's relevant to all sectors and programs in the aid and humanitarian space, and we can begin to actually undertake disability inclusive work by engaging with people with disabilities and making use of technical resources which are available. And thank you. And having now spoken for 50-odd minutes without a pause, I'm going to take a sip of water and see if there are any questions that come in through the chat box. Thank you. See if there are any questions that come in through the chat box. Thank you. All right, and I noticed that there was an earlier question from Sonia about gender and disability, which ACVID has responded to, and that is yes. Go into the DID4 website. You'll see that there is a whole range of information about disability and its intersectionality with a whole range of other thematic issues, including gender, education, social protection, infrastructure, health, pretty much anything you can think of. The resources are probably there. I suspect that I have been so informative that nobody has any further questions, or maybe it's because people are still eating their late lunch, I'm not sure. I'll give it a few more moments to see if there are any further questions. Oh, there's another one. Yes, one coming in now. Is there an aid quality check for disability? Quite sure what you mean by the question, Zoe, but so the aid quality checks, because disability is, we should be mainstreaming disability into all our aid investments. It means that any aid investment, certainly any aid investment that's worth more than $3 million, that goes through an aid quality check. Part of that quality check is for how well disability is actually being addressed in that investment. There are also some disability-specific investments. My area, for example, has a central annual disability budget of $12.9 million a year, which is used to fund the provision of technical assistance and some of our strategic partnerships, particularly around capacity building of disabled people's organisations. And they, of course, undergo the aid quality check process. And are there ways for NGOs to engage with DFAT's involvement in GLAD network and other global activities? Yes, there are actually. So, for example, the Conference of States Parties, there is a civil society component to that, and there is an Australian delegation, partly funded by the Department of Social Services, that attends every year. And we actually work very closely with the Australian civil society organisations that travel with us to New York every June for the Conference of States Parties. For GLAD itself, GLAD is principally a mechanism for coordinating donors, but we actually work closely with disabled people's organisations, and we rely on our civil society partner, the International Disability Alliance, to ensure that there is appropriate representation and involvement from NGOs and civil society in that event. Likewise, with the, for example, the recent Global Disability Summit, there was a huge effort made to ensure that there was NGOs and civil society involved in that. DFAT, for example, provided funding to ensure that we actually had civil society from our region, from the Pacific in particular, able to actually actively participate in that event. So there are opportunities. The most significant global opportunity for engagement and advocacy is the Conference of States Parties in New York in June, and that is the one where there is a well-established mechanism for having civil society participate and work alongside the Australian government delegation during the conference. Can't see anybody typing any further. So one last chance for any questions. All right, in that case, I am going to wrap up here, hand over the microphone to Vicky in case there's any other final housekeeping. Thank you everybody for listening. At least I hope you've been listening. And please, if you are more interested in the technical aspects of how to do disability inclusion, provide that feedback at the end of this presentation, and we will tailor the presentation next time in that direction. Also, do go in and have a look at the DID4All website. It is an amazing resource, and it's free, available to everybody. So thank you all. I'll just pass over to Vicky now in case she has any final comments to make.
Thanks, Mika, for the very informative presentation, and thanks everyone for joining us. As Mika has mentioned, next Monday is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and CDM Australia has produced our communication toolkit with a range of free resources to support organizations and individuals to celebrate the day. To obtain a copy of the toolkit, you can contact Gemma Muir of CDM Australia, and you can find her email address in the chat area now. Our next DFAT webinar will be on child protection, and it will be held on Tuesday, December the 11th. Before you go, please complete a quick survey, and thanks everyone. I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.